everyone, how's it going? Welcome to AP World History Modern with Mrs. Hall. That would be me. I am really excited to get started. I hope you all are doing well. Before we get started, I want to make sure you have a couple things so that you don't have to stop and start during the lectures. So I'm going to go over the couple of things that if I were you, that I would have during the lecture so that you can make the most of the lecture, so you don't have to go back and rewatch these as much as possible. My motto in life or for the year is working smarter, not harder. So you got to do some work, but to me, it's doing it as efficiently as possible. And considering the fact that we're going to be online, who knows for how long this year, trying to be as disciplined as possible and make you as efficient as possible, which is going to be harder online, to be honest, because I'm not there to watch you, okay? So taking my advice of what works, you're going to be a lot better off, okay? So first thing, in the module, in Module 1, the page where you had the link to this YouTube video, I also gave you a link to the main PowerPoint. So I'm going to be doing half the PowerPoint in this module and then the second half of the PowerPoint in Module 2. So we'll be doing half the chapter today and then half the chapter in Module 2. And so what I would do is maybe print that PowerPoint. So the very PowerPoint I'm going to be using today and then next week in Module 2 is that PowerPoint. So what I would do is print it. I would go ahead and condense the slides maybe into 6 or 4, per page. And then you can just take notes right on there. So you can listen to what I'm saying and you'll have on the paper exactly what I have on the slide, and then that way you can take notes directly on it, and then it can be really helpful on your tests and prepping for your tests, okay? So if you haven't printed the PowerPoint, highly recommend it. Also, if you haven't figured it out, if you haven't attended the live sessions yet, the PowerPoints are your best friend when you're doing your chapter homework, okay? Your chapter questions homework. So that's another thing I would have out because I will be touching on them. Your chapter homework not only incorporates into the questions, your chapter questions not only incorporate into the lectures, what I'll be going over and stuff, but also into the PowerPoint. So if you've started them or if you have them done, I would have them with you. I would add on to them because I will often reference them and say, oh, look at question number 2 or look at question number 3. You should be able to answer this when I'm going over a slide. Okay, so it's a way to double check your work or to improve your work before you submit it. And again, another resource to study from prepping for your test. Okay. So I would have the PowerPoint, which you can get on the page slide in the module that you get this YouTube video off of. I would have the questions also on that same, so chapter 2 questions, which you should have already started. If you haven't, I would get them out because then you might be able to get some of those done while we're doing this and then finish them on your own time. I also would have the chapter 1 video sheet. You should have already done that. So if you have not watched the chapter 1 video, that mankind inventors video, that 24-minute video, you need to stop this video right now and you need to go back and get that, okay? So have that because we're going to spend on this first slide, we're going to spend just like 5 minutes and go over what was important from that video that will be on your first chapter test, because your first chapter test is over chapter 1, 2, and 3. Chapter 1, there's only a couple questions on the first test from chapter 1, and it's really just from that video, and I'm going to go over that and make sure you got what you needed. Last thing that I would print off, if you haven't already, is the Code of Hammurabi. So that's that primary resource soaps that I'm going to touch on today in the lecture, but we are going to be working on next week in our live session for homework. Okay, I'm going to teach you how to do it. But I would go ahead and print it. It's also available on the same page that you got this lecture, just further down, and it'll say print this, and you'll use it next week, and it'll be due next week, but still a good idea to print it because I will be referencing it when we talk about early Mesopotamian society and King Hammurabi of the Babylonians today. Okay, so a good idea to print that, and then you'll use it next week when we do one of our live sessions. I'll take you through exactly how to do the soaps. Okay, so 4 things I would have. I would have the PowerPoint. Take notes on it. To me, work smarter, not harder. I would have your questions. If you've already done them or if you haven't started them, get them out. They have to be handwritten. Remember that. I will not accept any typed homework, and that's just to reduce plagiarism. I think that's pretty obvious. I would have your video sheet, which you should have done already, so I would just have that because we're going to go over it, so it's a way to make sure that you're being accurate. And then I would have the Code of Hammurabi, which you're going to have anyways for next week. Okay, so if you need to pause and get those, go ahead. If not, then here we go. Okay, so first thing we're going to do, let's quickly go over the chapter 1 video sheet. Okay, so go ahead and pull that out. Okay, the chapter 1 video, there was no other homework for chapter 1, so you don't need to read the chapter. There was no PowerPoint, there was no lecture. You didn't miss anything like, oh, did I miss something? Was there some extra homework? Chapter 1, we always just do a quick video, and that's just to get the real quick rise at the dawn of man, okay? The whole goal of chapter 1 is just to kind of get us really quick into where we become a civilization. So where is that where we go from wandering nomads to settling in one place? And that 24-minute video does a good job of kind of bridging that gap from the beginning of man, from caveman, over to really the first settlement and farmers, okay? So it talks about, where do our first early genetic ancestors come from, and they believe East Africa. We as humans, when you look at us in the spectrum of other animals, we're kind of weak, we're kind of pathetic. Look at our skin, we don't really have claws, we don't really have teeth, So we have to compensate for what we naturally lack, and how do we do that? And they talk about that in the video through tools, weapons. We compensate with our brain and through inventions, so through tools, weapons. So maybe think about some tools or weapons that we use, maybe a hatchet, a spear, bow and arrow, rocks, slingshots, those kinds of things that we've used weapons and tools to compensate for what we lack in our natural abilities, okay? One particular thing we've done so that our brains could be bigger to compensate for our lack of physical strength is the ability to cook our food so that we could digest it better. The ability to adapt with wolves, the idea of hunting in packs. We like that idea, and we even over time use animals, dogs being a great example of that, to assist us in hunting, right? And even horses we see later on. We see the adaptation of clothing, right? So that we can live outside of warm climates. So what we might lack in physical ability, our brains, what that video is supposed to show you, our brains helps us compensate for, to come up with how can I live in climates that I naturally can't survive in. And our brains help us do that through invention of tool or creating clothing so that we can survive in cooler climates, which I think is pretty cool. And what advantages do we see through other animals? Again, seeing I might lack the ability to see at night, but look at what wolves can do, and using animals and their abilities to our advantage. Now, there's going to be a joke this year, and I don't actually mean it as a joke. It's just because it's unfortunately a reality in history. History is written and ruled by men. Ladies, we don't really become important until like 19th, 20th century, okay? So we kind of turned it into a joke because it's just, yet again, women are subservient and everything is patriarchal society really until the last 100 years, okay? And so once in a while when we see a woman mentioned or given credit for something, we're going to over celebrate it, okay? Because we joke because it's so sad of how true it is in history that women aren't important and women aren't recognized. And stuff is that, oh, look, women are important today. And I don't mean that to make fun of it, but just to make light of just, because it's a long history of ruled by men, and so when women have a moment, we're gonna relish in it just a little bit. Okay, so I hope you'll humor me in that. I like to use humor a lot, so I hope that it's easier to get across that humor when we're in person. So I hope that through the lecture that you will have a sense of humor and understand that we're trying to understand history and make history interesting. And so humor is never meant to be disrespectful or to make light of important issues, but to help us relate and to make it interesting. So I hope that you can have that perspective with me. Okay, so we go from being wandering nomads when we no longer have to hunt or gather for our food, but we can actually produce our food in one place, okay? And the ability to do that means that we grow it, right? So it used to be that you would pick up and you would move every couple months. Well, we no longer do that when we start growing crops in one place. Well, this was by accident, and it was actually women, right? They show it in the video, women who noticed it in the trash. They say all the times one man's trash is another man's treasure. Well, in this case, one person's trash is a woman's treasure, right? Because she notices that the very thing they're harvesting in the fields is what's growing in the trash. And so she comes up with this idea of seeds and planting them, and then realizes that when you plant something and it grows, that you can control the harvest. So instead of having to go after and naturally look for it, you can actually become the producer of it, okay? Instead of just the harvester, which is pretty cool. which means the settling in small villages, which leads to the raising and domestication of animals, same kind of thing, staying in one place. But with staying in one place, we actually see more problems that are going to happen, right? With proximity of animals, we see the quality of life actually decrease. I always find this really interesting. The average height of man, the average life expectancy of man actually decreases when we start to stay in one place. And we see that in question number 8 and number 9, we kind of start to see that happen. Due to disease, right? Men actually would tend to live in a barn with their animals. And so if you look at question number 8, right, they talk about what is introduced, what a normal thing or problem is introduced because of close proximity to animals, and that's disease. Animals are gross, right? You know, they poop, they pee, they lay in it, and then humans back then, it's not like they had any concept of hygiene, of bacteria, of disease, let alone pandemics like what we're going through right now and social distancing and stuff like that. You just didn't even think about it, you know, swiped it away. And so it was not uncommon to get sick, which led to shorter life expectancy. Also, quality of food went down, which led to people being shorter. Another thing, land ownership and then competition for agriculture and competition for land led to warfare, so territory. So not only is our quality of life because of disease and proximity getting worse, but now competition, because we're staying in one place, all of our eggs are in one basket. We don't just pick up and move because the harvest is bad. If the harvest is bad, we starve now. There is no backup plan, right? Because this is our home, and this is the only way we know how to survive. We're not hunter-gatherers anymore. We stay in one place. We're settled. And so this leads to, ooh, our neighbors had a good harvest. We didn't. And so we are hungry, and our instincts kick in, and warfare happens. And warfare also leads to shorter life expectancies. And they talk about in the video, you know, that you could see that a lot of people died from their skulls being bashed in, aka people killing them. Murder, you know, not all that different from today. It's pretty crazy. All this death is going to lead to an invention. And another thing that sets us apart from animals is the care with which we bury our dead. Even before there was written record, we knew that there was religion. And the question is, how did we know? How did we know that there was religion before there was written record? How do we know that people believed in something beyond death if we didn't have writings to prove that? A picture, like, how can you really prove that? And it's with the care that they buried their dead. And the video touches on that at the very end. And what they find is that the care they buried their dead. We notice that they take ceremony in that they're buried in clothing with jewelry, with valuables, which shows this emotion or idea that we believe something happens beyond death, that there's meaning in death. If you think about it, animals don't stop when something dies, right? They might be sad, but they move on. They don't stop and dig a hole. That's a waste of time. If you actually think about it, the physical burying of something in practicality is worthless, right? It's a waste of time and money. It's going to decompose and you just spent a bunch of money. We do it because of the spiritual meaning, because of the symbolic meaning, right? Not because of the practicality of it. And animals are very practical. They don't see symbolism in that. Their brains don't work to it. They're survivalists and they move on. We see symbolism in it because we believe something else happens. And so we know that religion, or there was purpose in the afterlife. We know that people believed in afterlife because of the care that they buried their dead. And that's something really interesting, that even before written record, we don't know exactly what the beliefs in the afterlives were, but we know that there was belief in an afterlife. So that's a good overview of chapter 1 in the video, and hopefully if you didn't get some of those things, you need to go back and watch that video, because these are the things that are definitely going to be on the chapter 1 test. All right, let's start chapter 2. We're going to do about half of it today, and we'll do the other half in module 2. So here we go. This chapter is focusing on the early river valley civilizations, okay? So the very first civilizations that stay in one place. So we're going to do a couple of different things. First, what is a civilization? Okay, so we're going to define that. We're going to define what a civilization is. What are characteristics of a civilization? So by the end of really today, this lecture, you should be able to define what those characteristics are. So no matter where you went, there were 7 or 8 characteristics that all civilizations had. So that's something that we're going to look at. they all happened around the same time. So if you look at your chapter 2 questions, if you look at before you get to question number 1, you'll notice that there's date range, geographic location, and key civilization. Now, I'm going to go over this in the second live session of the first week, but anytime you're doing your chapter questions, these are things I'm going to go over at the very beginning of the lectures, is the date range for the chapter. So the date range for the early civilizations, or for this chapter, is 3500 to 1500 BCE. Now that's very important that you put the BCE, which is before Common Era, okay, before Common Era. Now when you get to 0, then it becomes CE, which is Common Era, right? So we're in the Common Era right now. We're 2020 CE technically, right? 2020 Common Era, okay? So technically, when we're talking 3500 BCE, we're talking over 5,500 years ago, right? Because you count down to 0 and then count back, okay? So we're talking the span of 2,000 years from 3,500 to 1,500 BCE, before Common Era, all right? Geographic location. Now for geographic location, you are putting the regions that we are talking about. So in this chapter, we'll be looking at like the Middle East, we'll be looking at North Africa. You don't put the names of countries back at this time, all right? So when I say we put region, it's universal to despite country. So no matter the time, you put the region. So Middle East, despite what country, the Middle East is the Middle East, right? Doesn't matter what time, you know, it's just it's a specific just location, not referencing country or nationality, or because those things come and go with time. All right. So in this chapter, we're going to be looking more specifically at North Africa, which will be Egypt, and then the Middle East, which will be Mesopotamia, Indus Valley. Those will be the 3 that we're kind of looking at specifically, okay? Now, for key civilizations, these are then the specific groups of people that we talk about in this chapter. So today we're going to talk about Mesopotamia and Egypt, and then next week in chapter 2, we'll finish up Egypt and we'll talk about Indus Valley. So this is where you would put the specific groups of people. So I would put Egyptians, I would put Mesopotamians, I would put Indus Valley. Those are the kind of things. So geographic location, that's just location, not the specific group of people. Geographic location is no matter the time, the location doesn't change, right? That name. And then key civilization or group, that is who was actually there, okay? That specific time. And then, so we'll start with Mesopotamia. So here we go. Okay, so taking a look at a map, where are these early civilizations, okay? So there are technically 5, we're going to look at 3 of them, okay? So we have the early Egyptians, we have Mesopotamians, we have Indus Valley, we have early Shang China, which we're going to talk about in chapter 3, and then we have the Aegean Sea population, which we'll actually talk about a little bit in chapter 3, chapter 4, but basically that's the early Greeks, okay? We don't talk too much about them, but they were all roughly around the same time. Now, if you look at them too, they also have something else in common, okay? So not only are they roughly around the same time, between 3,500 and 1,500 BCE, take a look at it and say, what else do they have in common? Similar line of latitude, okay? Which means that they shared similar climate, all right? So this tells you something, that early civilizations, when people were looking for where are we going to settle, where are we going to stay in one place, okay? They ended up in a similar climate. And basically all these climates at the time were very similar in that they weren't too hot, they weren't too cold. They were moderate climates, okay? Ideal growing seasons where they could get 2 or 3 crops, you know, enough rainfall, not too hot, maybe, you know, not too cold, maybe not a lot of snow, you know, a decent climate. You'll notice that they were near rivers, okay? Other than the early Greeks. Other early civilizations, the Egyptians, Mesopotamians, Indus Valley, and the early Chinese, the Shang Chinese, are going to be around rivers, okay? It was a lot of work to survive in one place. And so they didn't have the technology know-how like we do now to live in a desert. You know, think about all the things that we import that we don't have. They didn't have that ability. Trade was still very local, maybe within a couple hundred miles. So you can't be shipping things across the country. You know, you're either producing it locally or it ain't happening. So really picking an ideal climate was essential to survival because they didn't have the technology and the ability. So similar lines of latitude, and this tells you something about humans. What I want you to start to see in world history, or one of my goals this year, is to help you see that we as humans are actually not that different when you break us down, okay? We spend so much time today, especially right now, there's a lot of divisiveness, talking about how different we are, how divided we are, and I am not trying to downplay some of those differences or some of those issues, but what I want you to try to see is at the end of the day, we are really more alike than we are different. Despite religion, despite background, despite race, despite gender, a lot of different things. Our basic needs and things we need, when it really comes down to human survival, we are very, very similar. Look at this. It's not like the early Chinese in the Indus Valley, the early Egyptians got together and said, where should we all go settle? No, they settled independent of one another, not knowing about one another, yet they picked very similar environments. Why? Because they knew they needed similar things to survive. And when you look at characteristics of their civilizations, they're almost exactly the same. Maybe different languages, maybe different religions, yet they had them, okay? So what I'm trying to say is that the basic components of the civilizations and how they settled and where they settled were extremely similar. And so the goal is not that we don't recognize differences in civilizations, but that we understand that our basic needs for survival and what we seek to do to survive, and even our basic need for religion, at the end of the day, the reasons behind why we do things, at the end of the day, are very, very similar. Okay, so what are some of these key characteristics of a civilization? Okay, so what are some of the things that define a civilization? Okay, so here we go. And you definitely need to know these for the test, okay? These are going to be all over the test. So you need to know this not only for Mesopotamia, Egypt, Indus Valley, but this will be all over the test. All of them will have some form of agriculture, okay? So agriculture, growing their own crops. So in order to have agriculture, that means you have to have irrigation. Irrigation is considered a type of technology. This is why they would be close to a river. So it's a form of running water, right, that they can tap into that will flow, that they can water their crops. It's too much work to get buckets and buckets of water. You have to have a way that you can move the water in a large amount to grow your crops. Okay, so all of them will have some form of agriculture and irrigation to grow mass agriculture. They will have permanent settlement, okay? These smaller villages or city-states, okay? They will have some kind of centralized government. Here's the reality. Somebody has to be in charge. Without laws, without rules, without somebody in charge, it's chaos, okay? Utopian society is a farce. The idea that we're all equal and nobody needs to be in charge and everyone's just going to do the right thing, that'll last for a day or two until somebody steals something and then somebody wants justice and then it'll just be chaos, okay? Somebody has to be in charge. There has to be laws. There has to be consequences. Think about it. When you guys start driving, okay? I'll be honest, I like to speed. And so if I get out in front of a 25 mile an hour school zone or something like that, or 20 mile an hour, school zone, if there isn't a cop hiding every once in a while handing out tickets, do you really think that people are going to go slow? No, we're going to speed through it because we think we have somewhere that we need to be and we're not going to follow the rules. So all these early civilizations had someone in charge, some kind of organized government. They had a legal system. They had a set of rules, shouldn't steal, you can't murder, and consequences for that, okay? They had religion. They had some kind of belief in an afterlife, okay? They had a writing system, some kind of record keeping, okay, for taxes, for their history, for their laws and things like that, okay? They had kinships. They had political systems rather than kinship. So kinships were more with the hunter-gatherers moving from place to place, so political systems will replace that. They had specialized labor. Okay, now when you are a hunter-gatherer and you're moving from place to place, you do many different jobs. You might make the clothes and you prepare the food, and you might go out and harvest the berries and hunt for deer. When you're staying in one place, you have a specialized job. You don't do all of those things. Maybe you raise sheep, and that's your job. Maybe you raise wheat, that's your job. Maybe you're a blacksmith and you do all of the iron work and things like that. Maybe you're a butcher. Maybe you're a baker, you bake bread. Maybe you're a tax collector. Maybe you're a religious official, and everyone becomes interdependent and reliant on those things, okay? So job specialization is a really key component of that. Social hierarchy is something that you're going to see as well. There's a social hierarchy. And anytime people stay in one place, not everyone's equal. Look at any society, right? When I say there's a social hierarchy, think of a pyramid. okay? And at the top of the pyramid is your smallest amount, then you've got the middle, then you have the largest amount. And in almost every society, it's the same, right? The top of the pyramid is the wealthy. They make up the smallest portion of the population. Then you have your middle class. They make up the middle of the pyramid. And then the bottom of the pyramid, which makes up the largest portion of the population, is the poor. Okay? And this is always the trend. Throughout history, even today, the smallest portion of our population is the wealthy. Then you have your middle class. And what makes up the largest portion of our population, which would be the poor or those who make lower income. All right? Now, so when you look at all the early civilizations or characteristics, what does it mean to be a civilization to fit the definition? These are the characteristics that they have. Now, is there a problem with this definition? Is there something wrong with defining yourself this way? Well, what if you don't have a common tongue? What if you don't have a written record? What if you don't have a legal system? The problem with that definition of civilization is it can be narrow, because if you don't fit that definition, then you are by default uncivilized, right? You are barbaric, okay? And so it can be narrow, it can be judgmental. So there were other groups of people that were maybe really close to this definition, but they weren't as civilized and definitely weren't as considered as advanced. But when you look at the most advanced civilizations of the time, these were the common characteristics that they had, okay? If you look at question number 1 off of your homework, the social divisions that were persistent in the civilizations, you'll notice that there was basically a social hierarchy, right? There were the landholders who were at the top. These were the royals, the priests, warlords or leaders. In the middle, there were the farmers, the merchants who helped run the cities and the villages. And then at the bottom, always at the bottom, were the slaves and the poor. Men were over women. The patriarchal society is going to rule. And so even back at this time, there is going to be a clear social division or social hierarchy. So make sure that you're finding that in the book. I believe this one's on page 35. And you'll find a scanned copy of Chapter 2 on that Module 1 on the same page that you found all of this. Okay, let's talk about Mesopotamia, or the Fertile Crescent, so the first of our early river valley civilizations, okay? It's often known as the crossroads of the world, okay? So why would it be known as the crossroads of the world? Well, at this time, sea travel really wasn't happening, okay? So if you were traveling between the 3 major continents, Asia, Europe, and Africa, you were traveling by land. Well, how did you get from Asia to Africa? How did you get from Europe to Asia? You went through the Middle East. So it got the nickname the crossroads of the world, because literally everybody coming from somewhere going to somewhere was coming through the Middle East. It was the happening place, okay? It was known as the Fertile Crescent because it was very, very fertile. They had 2 major rivers, the Tigris and Euphrates, that were going through these areas. Now, Mesopotamia was decentralized. Now, when I say decentralized, meaning it wasn't unified under one central rule. Okay, it had what was called a series of city-states. So city-states were a larger village or city, small city, with a central government and then its surrounding property, okay? And that was like its own mini country. And then maybe 30 miles away, you would have another one. So imagine like Boulder City was a city-state. Las Vegas was a city-state. Henderson was a city-state, okay? Our proximity is fairly close to one another, but each one is like its own independent country, okay? We probably trade with one another, but we probably fight with one another, okay? So Mesopotamia was a crossroads of the world, which is a positive and a negative, okay? It was a positive because everyone that has anything is coming through there. So everyone with knowledge, with different religions and technologies, all the new stuff's coming through. It's like, wow, this is really cool. But with everyone new coming through there, it creates a lot of competition. So there's a lot of warfare. This is also kind of known as the war zone of the world. If you want to look at historically what region of the world historically has the most war through history, it is by far the Middle East, okay? Not only at this time, even current to present day. And we're going to touch on this many, many times. So some of it has to do with their location and some of it has to do with religion. 3 out of the 5 major religions are going to be founded in the Middle East. Anybody know the 3 major ones that are founded in the Middle East that will cause a lot of conflict? Think about it. Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Okay, so none of these religions are founded yet when we're talking about early Mesopotamia, but so part of it's their location. Everybody's coming through, and the more traffic you have, the more conflict you're going to have. But having 3 out of the 5 major religions is also going to cause conflict because you have 3 major religions claiming religious sites, claiming holy lands, and that's going to cause a lot of conflict as well. And we're going to talk more and more about that as we get into history. And we're not claiming that any one religion is right or wrong. We're just talking about the historical facts of what have happened and why this is the case. Okay, so it's not any one person's fault, and we're not placing blame. So I don't want anybody to get their, oh, where is she going? This is a sensitive topic, which it is a sensitive topic, but just helping you understand why it's a sensitive topic and being informed on that and not being ignorant about why that is. Okay, so Mesopotamia was a really interesting place to live, okay? For one, so they settled around 2 major rivers, like I said, the Tigris and Euphrates, and it was not a unified place, okay? Like I said, it was a series of city-states, so each one, so Babylon, if you want to look back at this time, 3000 BCE, what was the dominant city-state in Mesopotamia? That would have been Babylon, okay? And we'll talk more about that when we get to Code of Hammurabi, but Babylon would be the #1 city-state, so I would maybe make note of that for your test and things like that, okay? Now, the rivers would flood, which was a blessing and a curse. Now, they flooded, which was good for the crops, right? They needed that because it would help with irrigation. It would help with agriculture, which was good. But it could also be seen as a curse. Now, it would be seen as a curse because when the flooding would happen, it was unpredictable and they never seemed to be prepared. The problem is that when you're used to a lot of flooding, the Nile is going to flood a ton. And the Egyptians were always prepared for it. But what's going to make Egypt different is Egypt was ruled under central leadership or a central government. So all along the Nile, they had a centralized way of controlling the river. So they had dams, they had dikes, they had canals, they had ways that they would set it up so that when the flooding would happen to control it, and they did it in such a way systematically along the river to control the flooding so that it wouldn't destroy them, that the water would go where they needed it. Now, because in Mesopotamia, along the Tigris and Euphrates, they were a bunch of independent city-states, there was no cooperation amongst one another. So you could be 30 miles from each other, and while we should probably be working together with our dams and our canals and things like that to control the flooding because we hated each other and we were in competition with one another, we weren't trying to help each other. So maybe something I was doing upstream might actually sabotage you downstream. And so this unpredictable flooding really was just uncoordinated controlling of the rivers and the flooding. Now, they saw it as a curse because all early civilizations were religious, and today we're very used to this idea of separation of church and state, right? That we don't talk about religion, that the religion is not a part of our governments. We don't talk about religion. We don't talk about religion in school. We are going to talk about religion actually quite a bit in this course. Now, we're not going to talk about it in an indoctrined way of trying to convert people. We're going to talk about it in its role in people's lives and the historical presence of it, okay? So it's not a part of this course of you have to believe something. It's just the historical prevalence of it and where it came about. And the reality is, for most of history, religion and government absolutely mix. 100%. And so this idea of separation of church and state, this idea of separation of government and religion is actually a fairly new concept in the way that we live today. Because historically speaking, religion was the #1 thing in their lives, and everything had meaning. And back then, people were polytheistic, which means that they believed in multiple gods. And not only did they believe in multiple gods, but gods were everywhere. So God was the sun, God was the sky, God was the river, God was in the wind, God was punishing you, God was rewarding you, okay? So when the river would flood, maybe God was blessing you. If the river flooded and it destroyed your village, maybe you did something wrong. Maybe the gods were punishing you. Maybe it was a sign from the gods, So everything had meaning. So the people of Mesopotamia, maybe for you and I, we could see a logical explanation of why this unpredictable flooding was constantly destroying their villages, actually, and just uncoordinated controlling of the rivers. To them, it was the gods cursing them, and it was a sign from the gods. they didn't have a lot of geographic barriers, and this also caused a lot of warfare and then also a lot of the flooding as well. Okay, so let's talk about religion a little bit in Mesopotamia, okay? Like I mentioned in the last slide, early religions in Mesopotamia, Egypt, and when we get to Asia in chapter 3, all of them were polytheistic. They believed in many different gods. So you're monotheistic if you believe in one god. You're polytheistic if you believe in many gods. So make sure that you know the difference in that. So poly is many, mono is one, okay? And they believed that the gods were in every aspect of life, right? That they were in every aspect of life. They also believed that their gods were anthropomorphic, which I actually think this is really interesting, and you'll see this actually in a lot of current religions, okay? I'll use Christianity as an example, okay? When you see paintings or from, let's say, the Renaissance or something of depictions of God or, you know, the Christian God or something like that, he looks like who? Humans. If you look back to the early Greeks and you look at their gods like Zeus and stuff like that, who do they tend to depict? Humans. Anthropomorphic gods are gods that possess human-like characteristics. So the question is, why does man often in a lot of early religions, even the Egyptians do this, why do we tend to depict in a lot of religions, why do we tend to depict our god or gods in our image, in man's image is what I mean by that. Think about that for a second. Why would we tend to depict our religious figures or gods to look like us? It's actually quite simple. If I believe that I am the most superior thing on earth, which let's be honest, humans do, right? We control our environment, we rule the earth, we rule over the animals, we decide whether we kill them or not. You know, we don't see other animals telling us whether or not we can build a city here or do that. Heck, we built Lake Mead, the largest man-made lake in the United States, right? You know, because we wanted to, which when you think about it, makes no sense because we're in a desert, but we're going to do it anyways, right? Now it's half empty, but we're going to do it anyways. So we think we're the smartest things on the earth. So here's the logic. Follow me for a second. If I am the smartest thing I know, okay, on earth, and that I can imagine, when I'm thinking about my god or gods, the best thing I can think of must be something close to me. So we tend to think of something that we relate to. And if I'm the best thing I know, that I can imagine, that I physically know on earth, and when I'm imagining what my god or gods look like, we tend then to imagine them in our form because we relate to them, okay? Because we are the best thing that we know. So man believed that they were at the mercy of the gods, so they read into everything. So when there was a natural disaster, it was the gods cursing them. It was a sign from the gods that they had done something wrong. When there was a blessing, when it would rain, when they would have a good crop, they believed that that was a sign from the gods of prosperity or a blessing, or they were doing the right thing. So they absolutely took signs from the quality of their life. When things were going well, the gods must be really happy with us. If things are going bad, so if they lost in battle, if they had a hurricane, if they had an earthquake. So can you imagine, play along with me here for a second, can you imagine if we were living back then, having the year we're having now with the pandemic and things like that? Can you imagine if we believed these things, what kind of, we would be thinking of the gods? We would be like, oh my gosh, the gods must be so mad at us. We have royally messed up. I mean, we would be having the worst year, right? We would be thinking that the gods are super, super mad at us if you look at our current state of affairs and the year that 2020 has been and how challenging it's been, not only from the pandemic and the social issues. I mean, it's just been a really treacherous year, you know, on a lot of different levels, economically, and, you know, we could go on, and we'll get more into that as the year goes on. So the social structure, okay, so this directly ties into question number 1, okay? So all early civilizations had social structure, and they looked pretty much the same throughout the early civilizations, Mesopotamia, Egypt, Indus Valley, okay? So there were 3 kind of distinct social classes, and like I said, it's like a pyramid. So at the top, you would have the landholders, royalty, priests, merchants, and they would be the smallest group. In the middle, you would have the dependent farmers, so these are people, artisans, workmen, small business owners, things like that. And then at the very bottom, you would have slaves, you know, and they were going to be the largest portion of the population. Men are going to have authority over women and children. Women had legal rights, but very few. And the Code of Hammurabi is going to be an example when we look at the Code of Hammurabi. And like I said, we're going to touch on it today. So if you haven't printed that, pause this, get that out. But the Code of Hammurabi is going to be a really good example of where you'll see examples of social structure depending on if you were a landholder, you might have a different penalty under the law versus a slave versus a farmer, okay? So even under the law, how you were treated or the credibility you would have under the law, you would be treated very, very differently. What you're going to notice is that as time goes on, women's status will decline. During hunter-gatherer society, women actually had a fairly equal status. And then the more civilized, and I say that in quotes, my fingers are kind of in the air, the more civilized we become, this seems so opposite, but the more civilized we become, unfortunately, the status of women and the more oppressed women will become. So when I say civilized, what I should say is the more civilized men become, unfortunately, the quality they adopt the most is the oppression of women and the subservience of women, that they become more of an object than they are a companion or an equal. And it's not till the last 100 years that we see that begin to change. So that's where I joke sometimes, because it's just so depressing for a lot of history that women don't matter. So when we have our moment, we're like, hey, women have their moment, we matter, because it's such a dominantly patriarchal history that we look at. So like I said, the women in society, so looking at number 2, the status of women and their experience in Mesopotamian society, women in hunter-gatherer society, they had a higher status, but as the agricultural society is going to come around, agricultural society meaning staying in one place, civilized society, women's status will decline, no political roles, and they took more and more of a home role, so jobs within the homes and raising the children, and agricultural roles. And the men will work outside the home and take on more predominantly earning roles. Ziggurats are going to be the religious temples. So again, polytheistic ziggurats are going to be religious temples. They're also going to look fairly similar when we get to early Mayan or early American civilizations. They'll look fairly similar to their early ruins. The economy. So the early societies had barter systems. So a barter system is it's an exchange of goods. So without currency is basically a barter system is without currency. So maybe I'll give you half a dozen eggs for some meat or a loaf of bread in exchange for some cotton textiles. So it's an exchange of goods or services for another goods or services. So I could give you a dozen eggs and then maybe you would repair my fence, So it's the lack of currency. So that last slide, government, I already kind of went over that. Like I said, they were city-states. They were smaller societies where Egypt is going to be unified under one rule. And because of those city-states, so it'll be, like I said, like a Boulder City or like something like that, where the city itself, they'll have their own local government, they'll have the surrounding land, and then they'll have maybe 100 miles away or 200 miles away another city-state, okay? So city-state is literally where the city is its own state, okay? So that is what that's going to mean, okay? Technological advancements, irrigation is going to be a big one, canals, dams, transportation, boats, carts, the first wheels will come about. The metal of this time is going to be bronze. So we don't see iron and silver and things like that being used at. Bronze is going to be one of the first metals that will be used in Mesopotamian society. The writing system is cuneiform, so it's a type of symbol writing system. Looks very similar to hieroglyphs that the Egyptians used. And again, another one of those characteristics of an early civilization is having a uniform writing system. Having a written set of laws. Okay, so having a written set of laws is going to be another characteristic. Now, the very first set of written laws ever that we know of is the Code of Hammurabi, okay? And we're going to go into more detail next week, so I'm just going to touch on it today. This is probably one of my favorite primary resources. Now, primary resource means first-hand resource, okay? So directly from the time. And this is great. So when you print it, what you want to do before our live session in Module 2 is read it, okay? So Hammurabi was basically what was happening was Babylon was the creme de la creme of city-states. So if you could conquer Babylon, you were like really, really cool. So when he conquers Babylon, okay, he not only is the cool new king on the block, but he has a challenge ahead of him. He has to convince the Babylonian people and his people that he's bringing in to get along. Okay, it's one thing to win the war. Now he has to set up a successful society and get them back to work. War's expensive and he needs them to get back to work. Well, the problem is with laws, if they're not written down, think about a game of telephone in class. And usually when we're in person, we play this game of telephone. I'll whisper it to somebody, we whisper it all the way around the room, and then we see how much it changed. The analogy being, right, that when laws aren't written down, when something isn't written down, it changes, it's subject to change, it can be interpreted differently. So he is going to have his set of laws written down to help create consistency. And so the Code of Hammurabi is one of the first set of written laws. Now, the Code of Hammurabi, not only is it a government document that is an actual set of laws, but we can learn a lot about early Mesopotamian society from this. We can see the way religion is incorporated into their society. So we're going to talk about that when we do our live session. We'll see some examples of that. We'll see the way that the different social classes, that if you were a slave, how you were treated versus if you were a landholder, that there were definitely different consequences, or the way that you were believed. Depending on your profession, how you were handled, men and women, how it was handled. We'll even see some examples of laws today, like divorce and child support and things like that. So we'll even see, property division and things like that. So some things we can relate to today. Have any of you ever heard the saying, an eye for an eye? Like, oh, it's an eye for an eye. Okay, that saying, it's a common saying. We don't actually mean it, like I'm going to take your eye, you take my eye. But that saying comes directly from the Code of Hammurabi. And it was literally the idea that the punishment should fit the crime. So literally that if you take my eye, that the fitting punishment should be that I should take your eye. Or if you damage my arm, that the fitting punishment should be that we should take your arm. And so while you and I take that saying like an eye for an eye, a life for a life, kind of more figuratively, at the Code of Hammurabi, and we'll go over this live session next week, and I'll tell you then how to actually complete the homework. So don't worry about completing it. Just I would read it before our live session next week, and then I'll talk to you about how to actually complete it before you submit it for credit. Great example of how they literally, carried out their justice, and also how they incorporated religion. Religion was very much incorporated into their governments, 100%. Okay, let's talk about Egypt really quick. So Mesopotamia was the crossroads of the world, right? A series of city-states not unified. They saw meaning in everything. They were polytheistic. They had cuneiform for written record. They had social hierarchy. Two major rivers were Tigris and Euphrates. Okay, now Egypt is going to be different in a couple different ways. One, they are centered around one river, right? Okay, the longest river in the world, the Nile River, okay? And instead of seeing the flooding of the Nile as treacherous, which you would actually think they would see it as treacherous because it's a much bigger river than the Tigris and Euphrates, they see it as a gift. And the reality is, it's not because the flooding of the Nile was easier. If anything, it was harder because it's a bigger river. It's because they had a centralized government. So where Mesopotamia was decentralized, having many little different city-states. When we say Mesopotamia, it's a large group of people with many different city-states. Egypt is a unified group of people under one government. So it's a large area, thousands and thousands of miles under one group of, under one leadership, under one pharaoh. Okay, so many different cities, many different villages along the river. And so because of that, they had uniform ways of controlling the river, of controlling their agriculture, so that they could predict it and they could control the flooding. Now, because they could predict and control it, they always saw it as a gift. So it's not that they didn't see the Nile as a god. They definitely saw the Nile as a god. But because of their unified way of controlling the river and it not being unpredictable and sabotaging one another, they were able to make the most of it and not be so overrun by the flooding. So this is basically going to touch on like what I was touching on kind of on the last slide, okay? They did a better job of shaping their environment. Because Mesopotamia was decentralized in a bunch of different city-states battling one another, they did not work together to create barriers. They didn't work together to make the most of the Tigris and Euphrates. And Egypt is going to do a really good job of, growing agriculture in the best places and really making the use of the Nile and the villages and specializing even the villages and trading amongst the villages and the cities resources. So even job specialization within villages or cities, so that as a whole nation, they could take care of one another. Now, this is all going to be under the leadership of a pharaoh, okay? Their pharaoh, they believed, was a god, okay? One of the first really successful pharaohs is Menes. Now, when we think of Egypt, we tend to think of the pyramids, right? Now, what a pharaoh would do when he came into leadership, it was one of the first things he would do is he would commission the building of his pyramid. Now, the pyramid really was his tomb, okay? And of course, the goal of each pharaoh was to have a bigger tomb than the last one, right? So I want twice the size. Take that one and double it. Take that one and make it better. And so their architecture and their building projects were just phenomenal. But they had a lot of symbolism in their religion, and the pyramids were not just for anyone. You had to be super, super wealthy or a pharaoh. Okay, so your everyday person was not getting buried in a tomb. These were for their religious officials and for pharaohs and for people who had a lot of money. Okay, and their pharaohs not only were government officials, but they believed that their pharaohs were a god. Now, the Egyptians, like Mesopotamians, were polytheistic. And you're going to see this really, really common. When we get to China, you're going to see this as well, where you'll see societies. It's actually really powerful. Everyone was religious back then, okay? So today we've seen a decline maybe in how important religion is to people, or maybe people aren't religious at all. But in no time in history have we been less religious than now, okay? Back then, everyone was religious. I mean, it wasn't even a question, okay? And so everyone was religious, and you believed in many, many gods. And so how do you, if the most important thing in my life and the most universal thing everyone believes in is religion and their gods, if you want to increase your leadership, then you can't just be a mortal man, right? What do you want to be? A god. So what you're going to see all the time, and it's really smart if you think about it, okay, is a combination of political leadership and religion. So in this case, sometimes it's literal combination. I am in charge, I'm the pharaoh, and I'm also a god. So when I speak, I'm not just a mortal man, but I am a god speaking to you. So think how much symbolism that has to people. They're less likely to question authority. They're more likely to take you seriously. They're more likely to be obedient, to be peaceful. And when we get to China in chapter 3, you're going to see that they don't believe that their emperors are gods, but they believe that their emperors are appointed by gods. So you'll often see this done either where they believe their leaders are a god or their leaders are appointed by a god. And so you'll often see this combination of government and religion. So today we're so focused on separation of government and religion, where historically speaking, the power has been in the combination of the two, and society's really maximizing that, and the Egyptians will do that. So in part 2, so this is going to be the end of part 1, okay? In part 2, what we're going to do is we're going to talk about a little bit more about the Egyptians. We're going to talk about Indus Valley, and then we'll wrap up chapter 2. Okay. Hope you followed along and stuff like that, and email me if you have any questions. We went over at least 3 of the questions from your chapter 2 questions. So if you haven't been working on these, or if you did, make sure you're double checking those using the PowerPoint, looking in the book. The chapter outline is also your really good friend. All right. Thank you so much.